On June 10, 2014, a convoy of Toyota pickup trucks rolled into Mosul, Iraq, the country's second-largest city, and the Iraqi army collapsed. 60,000 soldiers versus approximately 800 ISIS fighters. The soldiers abandoned their weapons, stripped off their uniforms, and ran. Within 48 hours, ISIS controlled a city of 1.5 million people. Within days, they controlled a territory the size of the United Kingdom. And on June 10, before the day was over, they walked into the Mosul branch of the Central Bank of Iraq and carried out the single largest bank robbery in human history. $425 million in cash, gone in an afternoon. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-declared caliph of the Islamic State, announced the haul to his followers as a gift from God. It was the opening act of the most sophisticated financial operation ever assembled by a non-state actor. Over the next 3 years, ISIS would generate an estimated $2 billion in revenue, pay monthly salaries to 40,000 fighters, operate a functioning treasury with an annual budget, run a comprehensive tax system across 8 million people, and build a bureaucratic structure with ministries covering finance, education, agriculture, and public services. This is not a story about terrorism. It is a story about economics and about what happens when a military force decides that governing a population is more profitable than simply terrorizing one. The bank heist was a one-time event. Oil was permanent. When ISIS swept through eastern Syria and northern Iraq in 2013 and 2014, they did not simply capture cities. They captured infrastructure. Specifically, they captured oil fields, and they understood immediately that oil was the foundation everything else would be built on. At the height of their territorial control, ISIS operated oil fields producing between 30,000 and 40,000 barrels of crude oil per day. The global market price for oil in 2014 was over $100 per barrel. ISIS sold theirs at between $25 and $45, a massive discount that reflected the obvious risk of doing business with a designated terrorist organization. The buyers did not care about the discount, they cared about the oil. Turkish middlemen purchased significant volumes, transporting oil across the Turkish border through a network of trucks and informal traders. Kurdish groups, including some nominally fighting against ISIS, bought oil through intermediaries because pragmatism outweighed ideology when heating fuel was scarce. And in perhaps the most extraordinary transaction of the entire ISIS financial story, evidence emerged that the Assad government in Damascus, the regime ISIS was simultaneously fighting, was purchasing ISIS oil through Syrian intermediaries because the Syrian state needed fuel and ISIS needed revenue. At peak production, ISIS was earning between $1 and $2 million per day from oil alone. Over 12 months, that translated to between $300 and $700 million from a single revenue stream. What separated ISIS from every terrorist organization that came before it was not the violence, it was the administration. ISIS did not simply loot the territories it captured, it governed them, and governing a population requires revenue, which means taxation. The system ISIS constructed was comprehensive, systematic, and ruthlessly enforced. Every business operating in ISIS territory paid a percentage of its revenue as zakat, the Islamic obligation of charitable giving, reinterpreted as a compulsory state tax. Every truck, car, and motorcycle passing through an ISIS checkpoint paid a fee. Every agricultural harvest was subject to a tithe. Every contract, property transaction, and business registration required ISIS approval and payment. Entering the city of Mosul through an ISIS checkpoint cost $2 for a car and $5 for a truck. Multiply that across hundreds of checkpoints, millions of crossings per month, and the revenue becomes substantial before a single barrel of oil is extracted. By 2014, analysts estimated that ISIS was generating approximately $360 million annually from taxation alone. More than the entire government revenue of some recognized states. Not from extortion in the traditional sense, from a functioning, administered, documented tax system with receipts and records. And utilities were also monetized. ISIS charged residents for electricity, water, and communications. Citizens in Mosul received ISIS-branded utility bills. The bureaucracy was real. And here is the detail that most people find impossible to believe. ISIS paid its fighters a monthly salary. Local Syrian and Iraqi fighters received between $400 and $600 per month, significantly more than the average wage in either country. Married fighters received additional housing allowances. Fighters with children received stipends per child. Foreign recruits, the thousands who traveled from Europe, Central Asia and elsewhere to join the Islamic State, received up to $1,200 per month, plus accommodation. This was not charity, it was human resources management. ISIS leadership understood that a fighting force that is well paid is a fighting force that stays. The financial incentive was as important as the ideological one, and for many recruits considerably more reliable. Behind the salary system was a complete bureaucratic architecture. ISIS operated what it called diwans, administrative ministries covering every aspect of governance. The Diwan al-Mal managed the treasury and budget. The Diwan al-Zakat collected religious taxes. The Diwan al-Rikaz managed natural resources including oil. The Diwan al-Hidamat managed public services. ISIS published an annual budget, a budget, with projected revenues, expenditures and allocation across departments. At its 2014 to 2015 peak, that budget exceeded $2 billion, larger than the national budgets of several United Nations member states. Oil and taxation were the foundation, but ISIS had additional revenue streams that were equally systematic. Kidnapping for ransom was not opportunistic. It was a deliberate, coordinated financial operation with designated teams responsible for capturing, holding and negotiating the release of foreign nationals. In 2014 alone, ISIS collected an estimated $45 million in ransom payments. The primary source was European governments, France, Spain, and several others, who officially denied paying ransoms while quietly authorizing payments through intermediaries to secure the release of their citizens. The United States and United Kingdom maintained a formal policy of refusing ransom payments. The consequence was visible and deliberate. James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, and Peter Kessig, American journalists and aid workers held by ISIS, were executed on camera. ISIS announced explicitly that the executions resulted from the refusal to pay. The policy cost lives, but the alternative, paying ransoms that directly funded further kidnappings and weapons purchases, was a trade the US and UK declined to make. European governments faced no such pressure. Their citizens came home, and ISIS received tens of millions of dollars to fund the operation that would capture the next round of hostages. Among the most brazen and least discussed revenue streams of the ISIS economy was the systematic looting and sale of ancient artifacts. ISIS controlled some of the most archaeologically significant territory on earth. Nimrud, the ancient Assyrian capital, 3,000 years old. Palmyra, the Roman city in the Syrian desert. Nineveh, where the Bible says Jonah preached. These were not simply historic sites. They were treasure vaults. ISIS's approach to antiquities was characteristically systematic. They did not simply allow looting, they licensed it. Any individual wishing to excavate an archaeological site in ISIS territory was required to obtain an ISIS permit and pay a percentage, typically 20%, of whatever they recovered to the Islamic State treasury. ISIS then taxed the transport of artifacts out of the territory, taxed their sale to middlemen in Turkey and Lebanon, and sold directly through its own agents to European and Gulf collectors. The UN Security Council estimated that ISIS earned tens of millions of dollars annually from antiquities. UNESCO placed the cultural damage in the hundreds of millions. The precise figure will never be known because the transaction records are gone, destroyed along with the artifacts that weren't sold. By late 2014, the United States and its coalition partners had identified a critical problem. Military strikes were destroying ISIS fighters, vehicles and positions, but ISIS was replacing fighters faster than they could be killed, because it had the money to recruit, equip and pay new ones. The conclusion was unavoidable. To defeat ISIS militarily, you first had to destroy it financially. What followed was the most comprehensive financial warfare campaign ever conducted against a non-state actor. In November 2015, US aircraft located ISIS cash storage facilities in Mosul, warehouses containing hundreds of millions of dollars in physical currency, and destroyed them from the air. In a single strike, an estimated $500 million in cash was incinerated. The psychological impact on ISIS's financial planners was as significant as the material loss. Oil infrastructure became a primary target. Coalition aircraft destroyed oil tanker trucks by the hundreds, over 1,000 in a single month during Operation Tidal Wave 2 in late 2015. Pumping stations, refineries and wellheads were struck. ISIS oil production collapsed from 40,000 barrels per day to less than 10,000 within 6 months. Simultaneously, the financial intelligence community, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, working with European counterparts, systematically mapped and shut down every money transfer route connecting ISIS to the outside world. Banks in Turkey that had processed ISIS-related transactions were threatened with sanctions. Informal money transfer operators, the Hawala networks, were identified and pressured. Gulf donors who had been sending funds were named and designated. The combination worked. ISIS revenue fell from an estimated $2 billion in 2014 to approximately $500 million in 2015, to $250 million in 2016, to under $100 million by 2017. As the money dried up, salaries were cut, then halved, then stopped. Fighters who had joined for financial security began deserting. Governance collapsed. The bureaucracy that had maintained water, electricity, and public services could no longer function. The population that had been administered became a population that was simply occupied, and began to turn. By December 2017, ISIS had lost 95% of the territory it had held at its peak. Here is what the ISIS economy actually proved. A non-state actor with sufficient revenue can build the administrative, military, and governance infrastructure of a functioning state. ISIS was not simply a terrorist organization. At its peak, it was a proto-state, with a budget, a bureaucracy, a tax authority, a human resources department, and a treasury that happened to be built on violence and religious extremism. The lesson that military planners drew from its rise and from its fall was not primarily about counter-terrorism tactics or air power or boots on the ground. It was about money. ISIS expanded when it had revenue, it recruited when it could pay, it governed when it could fund services. And it collapsed not when its fighters ran out of bullets, but when its treasury ran out of money to buy more. Every terrorist organization, every insurgency, every non-state armed group that has emerged since 2017 has been studied through this lens. Where is the money coming from? Who is moving it? Who is receiving it? Cut the financial chain and the military chain follows. The Islamic State's $2 billion economy was dismantled. But the blueprint it produced for how a militant organization can transform financial resources into territorial control, governance capacity, and ideological reach remains the most studied document in counterterrorism finance. And the next organization to attempt it will start exactly where ISIS did, with a treasury.